The Y Curve with Phil Dobbie and Roger Hearing.
Think things are bad? Try being a Tory MP.
The poll numbers are pointing ever downwards. Few think they'll hang on to their jobs in next year's election. Many are already cutting and running.
Terrible headlines pile up every day. Inflation strikes, a collapsing NHS, Brexit fallout.
And what has Rishi Sunak pulled out of his sack? Reversing on green regulations, attacking ULEZ and eco-taxes.
Desperate? Definitely. Cynical? Probably. Effective? Maybe.
But what chance does the party that's held power for 13 years have now? Can it avoid a wipeout? Could it even somehow cling to office?
That's this week on The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates.
The Y Curve.
So, yeah, it is looking desperate, isn't it, for the Tory party?
I mean, if you look at some of the latest polling numbers, they are absolutely horrendous. But, you know, we are perhaps 6 months away from an election.
So one in the eye yesterday, not one in the eye, one from the eye newspaper,
for the Tories,
has got Labour on 44 voting intentions, voting 44% for Labour, 27% for Conservative. I've seen some having the Tories as low as 25%. In fact, Politico's poll of polls has got, 25 or 26%.
Yeah, it's a wipeout if that happens. But, I mean, you know, we've got a campaign to go before, but, I mean, they just seem to be thrashing out in all directions to try and find some way of saving themselves.
But it has been this bad before, hasn't it? So back in 2019, before the general election, just a few months before, the Tories were down to around 20%, and then they bounced back up again.
But that was one very specific issue that was all about then.
Of course.
You may remember.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a different thing going on here, because I think they don't know where to turn, what the party is. They're killing each other.
Well, it's exactly, it is. It's blue on blue, isn't it? Because this is a party now where the extreme right has latched onto the whole thing about migration.
Yeah.
And using, what some might call desperation tactics. Yeah. Well, I might call it desperation tactics.
You definitely would.
Do you know why I would call it that?
Why?
Because that's what it is, isn't it?
Right, yes. No, it certainly
so
smacks
Barges in Dorsey, you've got the deputy chairman of the Tory party saying, if migrants don't like it, they can F off back to France. I mean, this is not a party that's united or even has any sense of decorum about it.
And pushing itself further to a more minority area, many people think. I mean, it doesn't actually do them any good to push off to the far right, because it doesn't get them a lot of votes. And I mean, things like coming out of the European Court of Human Rights, for example. I mean, that's nothing to do with the EU. That goes back to Churchill's day. Yeah. And it will be seen internationally as an incredibly negative move. But they are talking about it.
They'll say, who cares about what the international opinion is? It's what we...
It's red meat.
Exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And it is growing this yawning chasm between the Tories and Labour. But the problem is it's just yawning at the Labour Party, isn't it? See what I did there?
You did. Very neat.
It's just, if we go to a Labour government, we're going through a period of very dull government.
Possibly.
And, is that going to last? I just wonder, it's something we can explore today, whether we are going through our own Trump moment. So Trump was very successful. Then he got ousted. We went through a period of, not particularly effective government. And it looks like Trump's going to get back in again.
But you think Boris is going to be taken to court and actually come back to power?
Boris might come back.
He'd have to have a few trials.
Well, whether it's Boris or, maybe there's some hope that perhaps...
Nadine Dorries?
You see, just...
not that we're biased or anything. We'd hate you to think that.
Yeah,
hate that. But the other factor, which I'm surprised you latched onto, is the economic cycle, because the way it's working is that most people feel poorer generally, and that is likely to come right the way through.
Yes,
and if it begins to turn up,
who would want to be in government?
If the signals begin to look better, then there's a reasonable chance they will start looking better pretty much towards the end of next year, which might be the moment of the election.
Now, politics may wax and wane, but you don't want that to happen to your hard-earned wealth. That's why you need to have it managed by Wigmore Associates. They are a boutique wealth management company who can look after your investments, your assets, your pension. They'll do their best to ensure that you get the return you deserve, so there's money for your future, for your children's future, and that you're not paying too much to the taxman as well in the interim. They'll help you get the balance right for your portfolio, depending on whether you're looking at a long-term or short-term plan. Give them a call. Contact wigmore-associates.co.uk. Their email is on the website too, or you can give them a call on 020 7224 3400. That is what they call in the business a paid promotion.
It is. It is.
Yeah,
and
just
it works.
because you
And
worked for the BBC for so long, it might be alien to you. That sort of thing.
Well, the main thing is they keep us on air, which is very important. But let's talk about the issues for the Tories and what's going to happen with them. Joining us, I'm very pleased to say, is Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University, London. And he joins us now.
So, Tim, it is looking pretty tragic for the Tory party right now. But of course, they have been in, low ebb before, and they've picked up. I guess it's a big ask, though, that they're going to pick up this time in time for the next election, isn't it? And without a change in leadership, which seems unlikely.
Another change in leadership?
Well, why not? But it seems they won't do that. So, but perhaps they'll come back after one term out of government.
Well, that's possible. Let's take the polling first of all. It doesn't look good for them. You're right. There are some recent polls which have the Conservatives, if there were to be an election tomorrow, which of course there won't be, on 100 or so seats, even perhaps below 100 seats, with Labour, around 450 touching on 500. That clearly isn't going to happen. But I think a lot of Conservatives are probably mistaken in putting their faith in some kind of inevitable shift back to them before the next election. Now, I'm sure there will be some tightening of the polls, but I think people ought to be very careful about assuming it will be anything like big enough to ensure that they get back in next time.
So, Tim, what is the problem that they've got fundamentally? It's a question, I suppose, some of the answers are pretty obvious, but what do you think is the fundamental issue that makes them so unpopular?
Well, I think you do have to look at some of the basics. I think the economy is very important. We've got used to the idea that somehow elections are no longer about economics, they're all about culture. I never really bought into that idea in the first place. But even if that were the case, I think generally speaking, it would be fair to say that economics trumps culture. And when you've got a situation where you've had, to coin a phrase, a cost of living crisis that's been going on now for at least a year, you've got a situation where, wages are only just beginning to keep up with rising prices. I think that is a real problem for any government. And then you look at the state of public services, and this is in some ways the norm for Conservative governments after a while. They are beginning to really feel the strain, beginning, as the opposition would say, to crumble. And people are noticing, particularly obviously when it comes to the National Health Service, and not just in terms of the, inordinately long waiting lists that some people are facing. There's supposedly 7.5 million people on those waiting lists, but also just day-to-day difficulty in getting an appointment with their GP, for example. And if they do happen to turn up at A&E, perhaps because they can't see their GP, they're facing very long waits there as well. So I think, those very basic fundamentals, if you like, are very important to elections.
A lot of that is difficult to fix. I'm not sure the Labour Party are going to be able to fix it. So the impact of inflation has already been felt. So even if we say, well, okay, wages now are growing pretty much in line with inflation, the damage has already been done, hasn't it? We've already had that you've already fallen behind, particularly if you're in a lower income capacity. So they're feeling the hurt. And I'm not sure Labour can do anything to fix that. And then, we have another fiscal Conservative in Keir Starmer who's not going to up government spending a great deal. So a lot of those problems are not going to be fixed in a hurry either. So that's what makes me wonder whether, in fact, we're in for a one-term Labour government without real much success in those things that people are looking for.
Well, we're really running ahead of ourselves now, but let's
do that a bit.
Let's
let's get to the election first.
Yeah. Well, talking about the election, talking about Labour, Labour have got a problem in the sense that if things are so dire, it might be very difficult for them to argue, particularly, as you say, because, they are fiscally constrained, to use that cliche, to persuade the public that, they've got an alternative and, they've got a solution and that it is an inspiring solution. But having said that, to fall back on another cliche, I'm afraid it is true that generally speaking, governments lose elections. Oppositions don't necessarily win them. And I think when you've got a government in this much trouble, Partly because of the way the economy has been for some time, but also partly because I think many people hold, particularly Liz Truss, responsible for crashing the economy, and therefore for the Conservative Party responsible for crashing the economy. Although they have got a new leader in Rishi Sunak, well, he's not so new now. I think that still does impact on the Conservatives' reputation for economic competence.
And it's not, I mean, you said it is basically economics rather than culture, but I was just thinking, if we go back to the whole Partygate issue when that was around, the economy it wasn't great, but we didn't have the problems we have now. And yet, I remember then the polls around the time when Boris Johnson went were pretty dire for the Tories, certainly for him personally, but also for the party.
Yeah, I mean, I think Partygate clearly is playing into all of this. I think the government gained a reputation there for being dishonest. I think the government also gained a reputation, not just because of that, but partly due to that, for incompetence, and that goes back into the Truss question as well. And I think when we're talking about not just the ability to manage the economy, but general competence, then I think the government is in trouble as a result of that. So I think it's the last two leaders have really been pretty negative for the Conservative Party. Obviously, for first Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, I think, isn't enough of a break from those two leaders.
Well, I mean,
the
problem is he's loaded, isn't it? I mean, he's there. He's obviously earning a mozza. So is his wife. They have foreign holidays when no one else can afford it. He appears on. He appears a bit smarmy in his very expensive.
He doesn't know how to fill up his car in the petrol station.
Well, he also has a bit of a problem with his trouser leg lengths as well.
Yeah,
but
you can't blame him for that.
You could afford a better tailor, perhaps. But generally, I mean, people are looking and thinking, well, hang on, he doesn't reflect my life. So it's the worst combination, isn't it? Someone who's loaded in a time when everyone is struggling.
Yeah, I do think that's a problem. I mean, I would put one caveat there, though. I think there is, to some extent, a respect among some voters anyway for people who are well off. And there is an assumption that they have got that wealth by
marrying well
into their own. Well, maybe
he was quite wealthy
into
before,
their
actually.
own efforts. There's a degree of respect, if you like, for people who've made money. And
sure.
I don't think that can be totally sniffed at. But I do think you're right. I mean, I think that the petrol station one, I would assume, will be played again and again as we move towards the election. I mean, I think the helicopters are a bit of a problem as well, to be honest. I mean, it's not just that it's environmentally suspect as far as a lot of people are concerned, but it does speak to a kind of lifestyle that is detached completely from
There's a metaphor there,
we
isn't
can work
it?
on a list of this, can't we? Because upgrading your electricity substation for your swimming pool doesn't look too good either.
Yeah, but I mean, we've kind of outlined, obviously the problems, Tim, that they have, and they're pretty obvious, I suppose. But what to do about them? Because we've seen a kind of change of gear in the party, it seems to me, in the last month or so, which is really, well, I think you could describe it as finding red meat to throw at the right of the party, whether it's on immigration or it's coming out of the European Court of Human Rights or various other things, and perhaps the Lee Anderson territory, we can call it, the deputy chair of the party. Is that likely to be productive, doing that kind of thing?
Well, I suspect it will influence some voters. I mean, we don't want to be too stereotypical about this, but I think there are some voters in the so-called red wall, who voted for the party because of Brexit in 2019, who might be pulled back into the party's fold by some of those policies. I mean, I think it, speaks to a kind of wider transformation in the Conservative Party, really, from a kind of mainstream centre-right party to a kind of ersatz populist radical right party, if you like, that you see on the continent. When you've got people like Lee Anderson, talking in the way that he does, not just in terms of, the message he's sending, but in the quote unquote salty language he uses. I mean, that is not a million miles away from the kind of stuff that populist leaders of parties on the far right, to be honest, in Europe.
But have they got that? I mean, is that us? I mean,
does it play here in the way it would in Italy?
He said his salty language reflects the righteous indignation of voters. I just wonder whether that is the case, or whether, we are all feeling indignant about asylum seekers coming into our country.
Well, I mean, I think, there clearly are some voters for whom that is an important issue. And if the Conservative Party can, distract and deflect by using that issue, then I'm sure they're going to carry on doing that. Presumably, they do think it has some traction. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. I mean, they are focus grouped up to the eyeballs. These people, they read polls in depth, as well as just the headline figures, they realise that their target audience, or at least some of their target audience, is going to find these kinds of policies and that kind of rhetoric quite appealing.
Including the the anti-eco policies as well, against ULEZ and what came out of the Uxbridge by-election. Does that play the same way?
Before we get onto that, just on this point, though, about, the anti-immigration stance, I mean, how is that playing out with the more traditional Tory voter? I mean, on the one side, it's almost becoming the nasty party, as far as it's,
Theresa May coined that phrase, interesting.
Well, there we are. Well, little did she know what was to come.
Yeah.
How does that play out with the traditional
I think you're right.
voter?
I think the migration issue and the rhetoric around it is a bit of a double-edged sword, because it could alienate as many people as it attracts. And I think, the Conservative Party have to be quite careful about that. But on the other hand, I don't think we can draw too strong a distinction between, if you like, the traditional, slightly more moderate Conservative voter on the one hand, and, if you like, the more kind of head-banging 2019 Conservative voter on the other. I mean, a lot of people in this country are worried about migration and do have pretty restrictive views on it. Now, I think the problem is more in the rhetoric for the kind of voters that we're talking about.
Well, the F off back to France is not what a traditional Tory voter would see their party as the language they'd be using.
I think there will be a whole bunch of, potential Conservative voters who are completely put off by that kind of thing. And I mean, in some ways, I'm making a moral judgment quite rightly. I mean, I really don't want, or wouldn't want, as a parent of young children, my children are grown up now, to see that someone who represents this government uses that kind of language. I mean, it really is just...
Well, it comes across as desperation, doesn't it? And then, so the question is the party pulling itself apart?
Well, that's the same thing with, I think, the eco thing, because, again, that's another sector that you probably alienate as many as you win over if you start pushing against green policies, which, I mean, certainly the youth vote must be very much in play.
Yeah, but then we get to this question of differential turnout, don't we? It might offend a bunch of young people, but young people don't come out and vote as much as middle-aged and older people. So there's a degree to which I think the Conservatives always feel that they can get away with, if you like, policies that don't really attract young voters, because they don't really feel they're going to be punished by those voters in the way that they would be if they were pushing policies that didn't attract pensioners, for example. So I think you're clearly right. And obviously, when we're talking about young voters, we might now be talking about people into their 30s and 40s who will be, parents of young children, and probably will worry a bit more about the environment. So you're right, they do have to be a bit careful about that. And of course, the question about ULEZ is that, well, ULEZ is a very particular policy being carried out in London. There are a few other places where, some kinds of schemes might come in, and, Cambridge, we've already seen a problem for the opposition parties there. But I mean, really, there aren't that many places in the country that are affected by those kinds of schemes. So it is a bit of an issue, I think, for them.
And ULEZ, obviously, that's a Labour mayor that's introduced ULEZ.
Well, no. Originally, of course, it was Boris Johnson.
I know, but, as far as the public's concerned, or as far as the message would be, this is a Labour government, and we're going to try and stop that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a good deal of overinterpretation of that result as well. I mean, only the Labour Party could turn a failure to win a seat that they've never won by just 500 votes into a complete disaster, PR-wise, for a week. I mean, it really is quite incredible. I think Labour could have done a lot better in terms of framing that policy in the first place. But, their reaction to the by-election, it seems to me, has been, totally counterproductive in many ways.
So, Tim, I mean, just thinking about the Tory party. Now, this is a party that's been in power for 13 years, one form or another. Obviously, there was the coalition to start with. They are also, by some measure, just about the most successful election-winning organisation in Europe, and have been, have done incredibly well over a very long time in clinging on to power. If a Tory now came to you and said, Tim, what can we do to win the next election? Is there any hope? What would you say?
Well, I mean, I think, to be honest, they can't run away from the economy. They ought to be talking more about, how their plan for the economy, to use George Osborne's phrase, is a long-term economic plan. I think, that was one thing I would advise. I would advise probably keeping off the migration and green issues, at least to the exclusion of talking about the economy. They really do need to do something pretty urgently about the health service, but whether they can do that in the next year or so, I think is a real problem. And I think obviously what they do need to do is talk about, some of the disadvantages of Labour's policy, in particular when it comes to taxation. And I think if they can convince people that, Labour is spendthrift, as they normally do manage to do at elections, and that Labour will cost you more even when, times are already tight, then, there is some mileage in that. But I do wonder whether, after 13 years, you have simply kind of run out of road, really. It's unlikely, I think, for any government to be elected, so many times.
It feels a bit like the late 1990s, doesn't it? It's like a reenactment.
But then, of course, you get back into this question as to whether the next election is going to be 1992 or 1997. I mean, a lot of people said in 1992, well, they've been in, 13 years, they can't possibly get in again, and yet they managed to. And in part, that was down to a kind of tax scare and, of course, a very effective campaign against Labour's leader. Now,
Keir Starmer isn't Neil Kinnock.
No, Keir Starmer isn't Neil Kinnock. And I think, personally speaking, I think many people would now say Neil Kinnock was rather better leader of the Labour Party than some people give him credit for.
No one's quite sure what Keir Starmer is at all, are they? I mean, that's part of the problem.
Isn't that his secret? His secret weapon?
Do nothing.
Yeah.
But on the point about fixing the economy, it's pretty hard, isn't it, really, for the Tory party to have a plan which is not going to spend more. I mean, you can't fix the National Health Service without spending more. You can't help people who are struggling without readjusting the distribution of taxes. Whatever you do, it's pretty much a Labour Party policy that you've got to come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is a problem. If your whole point is that we're not going to spend too much, it's obviously quite difficult to do something about the very big amount of money that you'd need to spend to put the health service right. And of course, they really are running out of time to do anything about it right now anyway. So I would agree with that.
Yeah. Austerity is not a vote winner, basically.
No.
Well, I mean, look at 2015. There's an extent to which if you can portray the other party as profligate, then, there is a degree, I think, to which people still buy that household analogy. You shouldn't spend more money than you actually have in the kitty.
Yeah.
And that can be quite effective. It was for Cameron Osborne in 2015.
But then Ed Miliband is not Keir Starmer either. So, I mean, I think this is the interesting difference.
The thing that people forget about 2015, however, is that actually the government did manage to get real wages rising about 6 months, a year out from the election. And that does make a difference. So if, as we're beginning to see now, wages are catching up with prices, then, that will, I think, help the government a little bit. But whether they can do, enough in the time they have available.
So you've said that a couple of times. So they might be catching up now with where they were maybe 6 months ago, but go back a couple of years and people have taken a big fall.
Yeah, and they've got the mortgage problem as well. And although obviously, it's true to say that, not everybody is affected straight away, you've got a kind of rolling thunder effect here where more and more people are coming off fixed terms for their mortgage, and they're going to find, obviously, that they are then paying quite a lot more. And I don't know if you heard Rishi Sunak in a phone-in program, I think it was last week, where someone gave a call, an average guy, I think 3 kids, whose mortgage had gone up, I think about, £600 a month or something like that. And all Sunak's, reply centered around was, what the average person was facing in terms of a mortgage rise, which of course didn't help that guy at all.
So that gets back to the whole out of touch thing, doesn't it? And if I always think with Rishi Sunak that he looks like the losing side on a high school debating team. He looks like he's been trained in how to talk publicly, and he does that. He moves the hand in the right way. He's got that smile. He's doing everything he's been taught, but there's nothing genuine.
There's
in
no
there.
authenticity,
and I think everyone's seeing through it. Yeah.
No, I think not only is there no authenticity, consistency. There's very little authority either, although he has managed, I think, to get a grip on the Conservative Party. And that is worth reminding ourselves of, because there was a lot of talk, I think, when Liz Truss went and Rishi Sunak came in, that the Conservative Party was ungovernable. And actually, I think what's happened is that the Conservative Party has now managed to kind of pull itself together, at least, and you're not getting huge rebellions in Parliament. You're not getting an awful lot of kind of backbiting against Rishi Sunak. I mean, given how badly they lost the other two by-elections, you might have expected, a bit of headless chicken action on the part of the parliamentary party.
Is that going to last? Because that actually brings me to the point I wanted to think about, which is if we make as a working assumption that Tories are not going to win the next election, a lot of talk at the moment about how far the party will pull itself apart in opposition and which direction to go. You mentioned perhaps, the right-wing image of the far right in some parts of Europe. And you've got a lot of very loud voices still within the party on that. Do you think that is the direction it's going to go? Is it going to be a party that just licks its wounds and comes back for another go? Or is it going to face something, pretty terminal?
Is it going to pull itself apart more? Yeah, because, you talked about there, the civilized times when we could talk about the state of the economy and, have debates about that. But really, instead, we're swearing about migrants. And I just wonder, we're in a Trump era, aren't we? And it looks like Trump might come back again. And, has that sort of infiltrated politics locally as well?
Would Boris come back as the leader of that, potentially?
Yeah, exactly. Just follow the success of Donald Trump, perhaps. So, are we entering a new era?
Yeah, I do think, there is a question as to whether this transformation I was talking about earlier from a mainstream centre-right party into populist radical right party is permanent or not. It's easy to think that, it is, but actually the Conservative Party's record over time, and I must stress over time because it doesn't always happen straight away after an election loss, is that it comes to its senses, as it were, and begins to actually rethink what it wants to do. And if you look at, for example, 1997, the Conservative Party did really head for the ideological hills, really, till 2001 and even till 2005. And it was only when David Cameron came in as leader at that point that the Conservative Party, began to think more seriously about how it needed at least to project change. Whether it actually changed that much is another matter. So I would expect that pattern to repeat itself, to be honest. I would expect the Conservative Party to double down on the direction it's taking at the moment, which is, as you say, is very, is rather kind of populist radical right. Probably elect a leader, like Kemi Badenoch, for example.
You think Kemi Badenoch could become the leader?
Yeah, I do think that she's probably in pole position. I think she's probably the bookies' favourite. And I suspect if you see, the way that she's positioned herself over time, that she's probably got the best chance. It'd probably be her versus Penny Mordaunt, but who can tell?
So how different would we be now if Penny Mordaunt had actually won the contest?
Well, I think, she's got this image as, slightly more moderate, slightly more liberal, but you always have to remember that she was the woman who basically, doubled down on the idea that Turkey was about to join the European Union in the Brexit debate. So I don't think she's
it's all relative,
she's got much compunction about running, a fairly kind of right-wing populist strategy.
We were so desperate to clutch at straws, weren't we, that we thought, let's choose a politician. Let's all get behind a politician who knows how to hold a staff upright for a long time during a coronation.
Yeah.
A sword, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, she, the cutting edge of Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah, but I do think that the problem for the Conservative Party, if it goes into opposition, is that, people won't want to hear very much from the Conservative Party, and the temptation for it will therefore be probably to, go even further on the kind of populist radical right thing, just to get attention, as it were. And I think, that's when we get into, people promising to leave the European convention, for example. You get even more criticism of, the Labour government, as it will be then, migration policy, etc. But in the end, it does often take a couple of election losses for the Conservative Party to think about, whether it can really carry on in that vein. A lot of what will happen after the election, I should say, does slightly depend on who is there in Parliament. And if they really get a shellacking, you will find that a lot of the kind of loudmouth, red wall,
they'll be out.
They won't be there anymore.
Well, I was going to say, that's an interesting question, because some of the biggest names are in some quite vulnerable places. Even Rees-Mogg, his Somerset constituents, I think he's looking a bit concerned about that.
Yeah. quite.
Could that shape the party?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think it will. And that's one reason I think that Kemi Badenoch is probably in a pretty good position, because it's very difficult to imagine her losing, famous last words in Saffron Walden. But it is easily conceivable that a lot of, as I say, the kind of loudmouths, I mean, the Anderson is the best example, not that I think he's ever got a chance of being leader, will be gone. So will Jonathan Gullis and Stoke, all those people that we've become very, very familiar
Nadine
with.
Dorries possibly finally, although we never know with that.
It doesn't really make much difference, does it?
I think we'll have to be a stake through the heart and the silver bullet to get rid of Nadine Dorries, to be honest.
But there was a kind of purge of the party, wasn't there, in 2019, of the day, a lot of the people who had formed a kind of centre to centre left of the party. And
yes, that's right.
It struck me that was really an epochal change, because you lost the voices that had in the past been that other side of the party.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you can overdo the extent to which, it was a bunch of sort of centrist MPs who got kicked out. I mean, I think a lot of them were sort of basic bog standard Thatcherites, if you like the majority of the Conservative Party. They weren't particularly centrist or moderate in some ways, but certainly on the Europe issue, they were a lot more, if you like, internationalist and liberally minded. And that part of the party does seem to have shriveled and died, really, which is why it might be more difficult for the Conservatives to come, to their senses, as, some people might describe it, after the next election, because, there's that bunch of people aren't there. Having said that, I think, if you do find that, a really bad defeat gets rid of some of the, the very kind of loudmouth radical right-wing people in the Conservative Party, then that gives, people who are relatively speaking moderate a little bit more of a chance to, get hold of the party again.
So there's two outcomes then. I take your point that it depends on who's left, but on the one side they become, which seems the sensible approach, let's be more moderate because we only need to go through one term of government because Labour probably aren't going to fix very much and some of those underlying issues are going to remain. So we'll come back as the reasonable approach to fixing, the long-term stable solution versus the no, it's just the extreme right-wing mob. We're going to yell and we're going to use as many expletives till people hear us. Which one's it going to be?
Well, I mean, I think what you'll find is that they'll try a combination of both after a while. I mean, I think there probably will be, a doubling down on the radical right-wing rhetoric to begin with. That won't work. I think, for one election, they might try it for the second term of a Labour government if we get a Labour government. And then eventually you will get, more moderate voices saying, we can't actually carry on like we are. We need to change.
Right, unless politics has changed forever.
On that point.
That's possible. That's possible. And of course, it does depend very much on the leader as well. Yes. So when we're talking about Kemi Badenoch, it is worth remembering that, her crack recently, when she was confronted with a bunch of Eurosceptics who were, upset about, her not doing what they wanted on Europe, she said, I'm a conservative, I'm not an arsonist. And I think in some ways, that suggests that perhaps she's not quite the kind of, central casting, radical right-wing headbanger that some people assume.
And very much on that point, because we haven't really mentioned the Brexit word that much in all this, and that has been the thing that has determined politics, really, so for such a long period, particularly within the Tory party. I mean, a lot of talk about whether Labour might manoeuvre back into a kind of Norway in terms of relationship with Brussels or something. But within the Tories, is it still the biggest issue? Is it still something that will divide them? Could they turn around? Could a portion of the party actually favour, rejoining? Or is it absolutely toxic?
No, I mean, I can't see that happening, to be honest, for 10, 20 years, as far as the Conservative Party are concerned. Having said that, of course, I mean, if the facts change, then, you might well find some Conservatives beginning to talk about that. But really, if you look at, for example, Tobias Ellwood, and, he's occasionally suggested perhaps rejoining the single market or getting closer in that way. I mean, the pile-on that occurred when he suggested that, I think, is indicative of where, the centre of gravity in the party is right
Almost
now.
as bad as when he cozied up to the Taliban.
Yes. I mean, of course, in some Conservatives, by the Taliban and the EU are basically the same thing.
Yes.
So you see, when you get a bit of hope, they always do something to stuff it up, don't they? So Tim, we have to move on. But I mean, out of everything that you've said, I mean, I'm not seeing any great hope for any politicians really anywhere actually talking about anything which is going to be for the good of the economy. It's all to do with the good of the party.
Yeah, true. I mean, I do think with regard to Labour, and we've talked a lot about the Conservative Party, I mean, there is a question as to whether what Labour is saying or isn't saying in order to try and ensure that it wins the next election will actually govern its policy once it becomes the government. That you could well find, as you find with other governments, them saying all sorts of things in order to make it into office and then doing all sorts of very different things once they're there. And I mean, just look at 2010, David Cameron talking about there will be no swinging cuts. It was all about the NHS, it was modernisation, et cetera, et cetera. And then we got this incredible austerity policy and this promise to clamp down on migrants, which of course they didn't deliver on. So I do think we have to take whatever Keir Starmer says with a pinch of salt, and it might not be very inspiring, but if I guess his plan is it wins them an election, then all well and good, and at that point all bets are off
by any means necessary.
Exactly. So what you're saying is he might become prime. He might actually become interesting after the election. We can live in hope on that, irrespective of what he comes up with. That would be a step forward.
First, that's right.
All right, Tim, thank you so much for doing that. Really interesting, and we will see. The next year will be very interesting, both here and on the other side of the Atlantic, but I think particularly here.
And we'll talk to you again soon, Tim.
Cheers.
Thanks
for having me.
Yeah, politicians not doing what they promise. I mean, that's unheard of, surely.
I just wonder whether we're all just going to get sick of politics and, it's whoever, we don't really care. We'll just...
that's when it all goes wrong, because they get on with whatever they want to do.
Yeah, but do they make much difference, ultimately? I mean, when you say, they're going to fix the economy, well, if you want to, if you actually want to improve the lot of people, then change the Bank of England to, or the governor of the Bank of England, change the approach, start cutting interest rates rather than...
So a government remove the Bank of England's independence, perhaps?
Yeah, or I don't know, or we just...
I can think of a country where that kind of thing goes on quite a lot. Can you?
Well, there's a few of them, aren't there, really?
Let's talk about China, because that is where clearly the economy is directed.
Yes. Absolutely, and they are, suffering big problems right now.
Which is rather interesting, because China is going through deflation.
Well, it is at the moment, yeah. How long it'll last. But yeah, I mean, it is the opposite of what we're all contending with. That's for sure.
And a big problem for China, because the whole of the Chinese deal, if you like, is prosperity, and what will happen to the country if they don't deliver on that, but also because the world is so tied in with the Chinese economy.
They've got a double problem, haven't they? Because they've got deflation, which is a problem in itself, but also deflation with a slowing economy as well. Yeah. So they really are in trouble, and you wonder how much of it is just because there's a lack of confidence domestically, how much of it is the follow-on from COVID, but also decoupling from the West as well. How much of it is they're just not selling stuff to us, and we're not selling stuff to them? How much of that is impacting their economy as well?
So how our economy interacts with their economy, and indeed the global economy. It's an interesting subject. We're going to tackle it next week.
And what does China do faced with this, where you've got a political party that's promised that everyone is going to be better off all of a sudden when they're not? How are they going to respond to that? Yeah. What tends to happen, of course, when the chips are down, is that countries look to start a war somewhere, for example.
And talking of chips, of course, microchips are a big issue and all that as well.
So much to talk about next week.
Lots to talk about, and we will be talking about it and debating next week on...
The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.
The Y Curve.